Kaimere is a distant planet. It is defined by waves of life brought from Earth and set free to evolve independently in this new context. The indigenous life of the planet, swarms of microbes called magic by the people who live there, are what harvest Earth organisms and make copies on Kaimere. As the asteroid which concluded the Mesozoic never struck Kaimere, dinosaurs remain the dominant terrestrial megafauna.
Trilobites were among Kaimere's first success stories. Just as these armored arthropods were in decline on Earth toward the end of the Devonian, 4 clades were introduced to the oceans of Kaimere. Initially, while this planet had similar atmosphere and gravity to Earth, it still took many millions of years of harvest for the planet to truly become welcoming to Terran life. Trilobites were among the earliest pioneers to make this world a good home, erupting in population once the climate and marine biosphere became increasingly influenced by microbes from Earth. By the time of the earliest good fossil formations, trilobites of all 4 clades were by an order of magnitude the most abundant preserved specimens. This may be a bias in their hard shells being good for fossilization, so one shouldn't assume this was the entire world of trilobites, but it does speak to their great success either way. Some in the assembly do consider this to have been the first real dynasty of Kaimere, but it's difficult to pin down what trilobite speciation was the result of new harvest, and what were the natural consequences of adaptive radiation. Adaptive radiation is a phenomenon in which many species are able to quickly adapt to more niches and body plans than they once occupied because of vacancies in the local ecology. Adaptive radiation usually follows events of migration or extinction. The first adaptive radiation of trilobites was not the result of an extinction in Kaimere. While it would be fair to say that the proliferation of these first Earth organisms did result in the extinction of many native Chimeran organisms, Kaimere did not have any multicellular organisms. The competition to Chimere's native fauna was largely microscopic. Trilobites weren't out competing anything. Having a highly diverse prey base, both in sift-feeding Terran and Chimeran microfauna, and scavenging or hunting other invertebrates, trilobites in Kaimere rapidly diversified. Though the fragmentary nature of the fossil record makes it impossible to say for sure just how diverse they became, this fairly short period of Kaimere's geological history has over 1,000 named species just from the known world. Much of their early success we will discuss today was covered at the beginning of my Modern Trilobite episode, but I'll still cover it in brief before getting to the breadth of the diversity later on. I will mostly be covering the fossil formations of the known world. While a few realms beyond have decent fossil sampling, the fossil record of these regions has only a fraction of the known world that has been studied. As I mentioned in my primary Trilobites episode, there were 4 major clades of trilobite harvested from Earth during the Devonian. The Phacopids were initially the most successful of these pioneers. Phacopids have especially complex eyes, perhaps helping them establish themselves in this new world. Many had dynamic ornaments on their head, presumably to flip over competitors. The Lycids were another successful group, best known as fortified trilobites that were masters of rolling up. Most trilobites seem to have been capable of rolling up, but the Lycids were often best at it. Many also came with highly ornate spikes, aiding in this defense. The horseshoe-shaped harpids were fairly restricted in filter-feeding niches on the open floor, but were still quite successful in this role. The burrowing protids filled in whatever gaps they could find, generally being subordinate to the other 3 clades. As seems to have been the doom of many trilobite species on Earth, the proliferation of plants on land in Kaimere, in the wake of fungi and other preludes making the soil in which these first forests could grow, had cataclysmic consequences. An eruption of limiting nutrients released into the waterways resulted in booms of both magic and algae, clogging the waterways. Soon most freshwater ecosystems were choked out with rot, and the oceans became clogged with mats of decay. Most animals of Kaimere perished. It has been postulated that getting out of the toxic waters may have been a driving force in the first terrestrial pioneers of Kaimere. Eventually, the toxic waters washed away and runoffs decreased, and opportunity came to the global ecology once more. Two lineages of trilobites persevered, likely reduced to only a few scarce populations that survived this mass extinction: the protids and harpids. On Earth, harpids did not survive this transition. It is still a matter of conjecture how they managed to survive in Kaimere yet perished on Earth under similar circumstances. Perhaps there were sanctuaries of currents deep enough waters that they were able to still reproduce in the shallows. Most modern harpids are entirely deep-sea specialists, and their general absence in Kaimere's fossil record after the greening of Kaimere suggests that this may have been the case for a long time, and could well have been the key to their survival. For more information on the harpids of this setting, please watch this episode here. The protid trilobites had much more success in Kaimere. Indeed, on Earth, they were the only clade to survive into the Carboniferous and Permian. In Kaimere, they not only endured the water, but as the shallows became saturated with rotting flora, a lineage of protid trilobites made an adaptation no trilobites on Earth ever seems to have explored: freshwater and even terrestrial life. While there are potential trace fossils of both freshwater and even possibly shoreline travel on Earth, these pioneers on Kaimere took this to a whole new level. Indeed, there was a brief period of time in the aftermath of plants taking over the land and the waterways being clogged with algal blooms that terrestrial trilobites appear to have been more diverse and abundant than their ocean-bound kin. Presumably, some part of their lifestyle still required aquatic, if not marine, exposure, but this must have been minimal enough that they could thrive while their ocean cousins were reduced to a few remote populations spared by fortunate currents. The first dynasty began on land once the forests and swamps became established. This was a time of tremendous abundance for terrestrial and freshwater flora and fauna, but the marine ecology was still in recovery. Biodiversity was low, as so few marine species survived, but harvests from the early Carboniferous helped supplement the marine cast. Soon, these few thousand species erupted in population again, given the many vacancies once more, and adaptive radiation saw thousands of new clades develop in the evolutionary blink of an eye. Trilobites in land and sea all partook in this explosion. Harpids seem to have remained fairly basal, being detritivores and filter feeders favoring deep water. Indeed, they are entirely absent in some eras. Most of this diversity was in the establishment of new protid clades. Indeed, many of the lineages most abundant in the known world today, notably Plumacauda and Arthrocantha, have had their first members in the first dynasty, though modern families would not be recognized until much later. Like ammonoids, trilobites are often very reliable proxies in establishing the approximate age of a given formation. Many species in clades have tremendous success after an extinction, often within 1 million years. This may not seem like a direct indication of a harvest in a fossil record. There is often not much in the way of indication for a harvest in the fossil record, but many harvests in the Mesozoic and Permian can be narrowed to at least within 1 million years thanks to careful monitoring of trilobite fossils. Thalassotalpa is a clade today represented by the mole trilobites in Thalassotalpidae. This highly speciose trilobites are a fairly recent radiation, but represent a small branch of a once very diverse lineage. The notable boom of Chimeran trilobites in the first dynasty was a clade of thalassotalpans called Calabologomids. These make up as much as 90% of trilobites in some first dynasty formations. Like the modern thalassotalpids, they were prolific burrowers, which seems to have been proposed to help them endure the catalyst of the first dynasty. They were generally around an inch long or less. Carabologomyids were incredibly successful right away, though as the planet cooled and sea levels decreased, the abundant habitats of shallow waters they thrived in was increasingly reduced, and their diversity with it. Changing climates meant extinction, and there was a prelude to new harvest. New flora and fauna was introduced to Kaimere and made bids for a home in this new world. Competition from many newly harvested Permian fauna hindered the Carabologomyids, and a group called the holotrogids, already in Kaimere, began to diversify into these new lineages. Though the Carabologomyids persisted as the most abundant trilobites even amidst these challenges. The conclusion of the first dynasty is marked by a mass extinction. The planet was already cooling and becoming more arid as continents converged upon one another, but an asteroid impact around 255 million years ago was the death to millions of species. The Carabologomyids were a casualty of this extinction, and the thalassotalpa would not be seen again in a major species diversity until the modern inland sea almost 250 million years later. The terrestrial ecosystems of the Permian dynasty were fairly depauperate. Yes, there was a fair diversity, but in this era, cold and arid compared to its predecessor, the relative sparse foliage meant there wasn't much in the way of megafauna. There simply wasn't a base to support them. Most life seems to have been small and concentrated in coastal forests. At the beginning of this dynasty, most of the continents were converged upon one another, so interior regions were especially barren. As the continents began to break apart at the beginning of this dynasty, volcanism in the rift valleys may have made life on land even harder. Terrestrial life may have not been particularly abundant, but this was the golden age of Kaimere's oceans. Native magic and earth-based plankton appears to have been at the height not seen before or since. Colder waters tend to mix more readily with deeper layers, bringing up abyssal nutrients. Continental drift was common at this time, and the polar continents broke off of Hyrule, meaning there was a tremendous amount of nutrients being brought to more habitable waters by this combination of cold and seismic movement. The consolidation of the continents made for a vast ocean. A staggering foundation of the marine food web supported an abundance of oceanic megafauna. This was truly an age of sea monsters. Indeed, while some in the assembly call it the Permian dynasty, many call it the Age of Sea Monsters, as translated from the term of this era in the geology of the Great Library. Numerous lineages of terrestrial flora and fauna adapted to marine niches. Filter feeders and macropredators evolved from clades entirely unique to Kaimere, many of which had their origins on land. Even amidst this competition, trilobites thrived with flying colors, being a common element of these rich formations. The preeminent trilobites of the Permian dynasty was a clade of early members of Plumicauda. These were the holotrogids. Their populations were never abundant in the first dynasty, but their diversity back then was high, making them primed for irradiation as soon as opportunity presented itself following the asteroid impact. Some lacked the famous and nominative feathered tail of many modern members of the clade, but shared the diagnostic, dexterous, and sophisticated mouthparts compared to other trilobites. These became highly diverse in diet and niche, with algal foragers on rock and reef, burrowing worm specialists, open swimming filter feeders, and even a macropredatory clade that specialized in other holotrogid trilobites. Other trilobites are found in the sedimentary layers, but as the regionally extinct Carabologomyids had ruled the known formations of the known world throughout much of the First Dynasty, the holotrogids were now the preeminent members of this age. Volcanism continued the cycle of destruction and creation. On land, as the Permian dynasty came to a close, the world became extremely hot and humid. Jungles and wetlands once more defined the land. All this was excellent for terrestrial fauna, but the oceans became isolated and hot, preventing much of the circulation of nutrients that made marine ecosystems so prolific in the age of sea monsters. This era gave way to the Age of Crocodiles, or the first of the Mesozoic dynasties. The Age of Crocodiles was a golden age of terrestrial and freshwater trilobites. In the sea, however, things were less optimistic. Hot climates made for more shallows, but there was a lot of new competition brought by the harvests following the many megafaunal extinctions of the seaways. Holotrogids persisted as the most common trilobites, though they lost several niches to other clades. The Age of Crocodiles concluded with 7 million years of ice ages. This was devastating to terrestrial fauna, especially those in the polar continents, but marine ecosystems still suffered in the fluctuation. Arthrocantha was the lineage which became the preeminent trilobites when the proverbial dust settled. Holotrogids are extinct in the known world today, though there are rumors of some possible survivors in the interior seaway of Kyrule. Otherwise, this was the end of their reign. The Arthrocantha trilobites were originally mistaken for lichens since they are quite similar in their spines and proficiency rolling up. The Arthrocantha clade became the most successful in the Mesozoic dynasty. Of these, their most common family was the Scipio-Neptunids. Able to easily form a hard ball of spikes when threatened, indeed a position in which they are often found, they were quite well fortified. Again, other clades are found in the Mesozoic dynasties, but these are the most abundant. The ancestor or earliest members of most modern families found in the known world can also be found in these formations. Indeed, there was a massive radiation of harpids during the First Cretaceous dynasty. A vast majority of trilobites at this time, however, were these Scipio-Neptunids. The dynastic extinction was extremely devastating to both marine and terrestrial flora and fauna of the known world. Most native trilobites went extinct, with only a few thalassotalpid species being the only trilobites in the known world for almost 1 million years. Others trickled in and diversified from waters beyond. By 10 million years ago, all 6 modern protid families had populated the known world. The most abundant clade was and remains the mole trilobites in Thalassotalpidae. They are a distinct lineage from the Carabologommids of the First Dynasty, but are in the same protid clade and are quite similar. All are very small. 8 million years ago marked the formation of what is now the Tracheiam, or inland sea. By 6 million years ago, it would be recognizable in broad strokes as it is today, a very shallow seagrass meadow spanning 1,000 miles across and with thousands of islands scattered between. Fossil study of a few islands shows the modern dominance of the meadow-trilobites of Arthrocanthidae is the most abundant of the larger trilobites is actually an extremely recent phenomenon. Most larger trilobites prior to 1.5 million years ago were in the Arthrocervid family. It is unknown why the elk trilobites lost to the meadow trilobites. At this time, sea levels in Kaimere dropped to such a degree that as much as half of the inland sea's area was tidal or terrestrial. Many other animals experienced a turnover in this brief yet devastating exchange. There are still many species of elk trilobite, notably the moosehead, which can grow over 1 meter long, but they are far outnumbered in species and population by meadow trilobites, which dominate the medium-sized trilobite caste. Only one harpid species is regularly found in the known world, the hoofhead. All other trilobites in the known world belong to the protids. Harpids are quite abundant in the abyss, as seems to have been their only refuge, since shortly after the introduction to Kaimere. The hoofhead is not the only harpid in shallower waters, though. Several coastal surveys of regions beyond the known world have found other shallow water harpid species, though it must be said a staggering majority of Kaimere's trilobites belong to the protid clade. As we will learn next month, there may also be a relic species of like it in the form of Kaishell's pearl bug, though it may be a Scipion neptunid. Its phylogeny is a matter of some debate. For a list of the modern trilobite clades most abundant in the known world, I encourage you to check out this episode on Trilobites in Kaimere. Cheers to the Siren Lord for sponsoring this episode. Trilobites may be an icon of paleontology, but they often have a reputation in paleo circles of being doomed to extinction. They were extremely successful for a very long time and endured many of the worst conditions Earth has ever had to offer. I very much appreciate having someone like the Siren Lord to look over and suggest elements of implementing trilobites in Kaimere. I also want to give a shout out to the staff at the Museum of the Earth in Ithaca, New York. I was grateful to have a nearby collection of so many specimens to draw from. Granted, most of the collections are of ages on Earth prior to the introduction of our flora and fauna to Kaimere, but there were enough specimens that I was able to get a sense of the major clades and their evolution and adaptation over time. The Museum of the Earth and its affiliates at the PRI, such as the Cayuga Nature Center, are facing hard times. Centers like this are pivotal in providing educational resources to the public. I was raised on museums. My passion and wonder for the natural world may have been ignited by walks in the woods and reading books from the local library, but it was fueled by institutions like the Museum of the Earth. I was a docent there in middle and early high school when we first moved to New York. I cannot overstate how formative this place was in my early conception of Kaimere. I owe much of who I am and what I do to this and similar museums. Even in this time of hardship, they were very enthusiastic in helping me learn and illustrate a lot of the trilobites you've seen in today's episode, and also helpful in the work of a few other episodes I've got on the horizon. Knowing our past is imperative to thriving in our future. We need the Museum of the Earth and others like it. I've made several donations myself, and if you are able, I encourage you to do the same. Also, if you can, give them a visit. They've done a fantastic job showing the vast diversity of life on Earth through several profound and engaging exhibits. I also urge you to look at your own local museums. A lot of them get by on a lot of small donations, and a little bit can go a long way in maintaining these invaluable institutions. Thanks again to the Siren Lord for this sponsorship, to the Museum of the Earth and their staff for their helping me with specimen reference, to my many new and most generous Patreon patrons for your support, and thank you for watching. Cheers, folks!